I put this next panel together because from my perspective, in the past year or year and a half, there's been a lot of experimentation with consensus algorithms, and surprisingly to me, a bit not as much kind of experimentation around cryptoeconomics. And when I'm talking about cryptoeconomics, really the two things that I think we're going to talk about for the most part is one, kind of token distribution and how you get a token that you're launching in the hands of users that really care about it in a low friction way. And then two, kind of value and long-term value capture. Because from my perspective, right now, particularly if you talk to institutional investors, for example, the only token that exists where there's a really clear narrative for if the product is successful, the token will capture significant long-term value is Bitcoin. And so I think even something like ETH, the kind of long-term narrative for value capture is a little unclear. So I guess my first question to you guys would be maybe, do you guys agree with this kind of statement or not around kind of the long-term value capture of tokens broadly?
Maybe I'll start. Hi, everyone. So I think that's a really interesting question around kind of what is the narrative of the product, which is the protocol, and whether or not that product deserves to capture value depends very much on the definition of the product. And if you saw sort of the narrative of Bitcoin sort of morph many different times before it arrived right now at kind of store value, then I would say kind of that's how Bitcoin found product market fit. And so from that perspective, Bitcoin captures value because finally now the definition of product makes sense for value capture. But for Ethereum, I think we're still kind of far away from that because there's still several different narratives going, and there's people that support each of these narratives, and maybe some of them deserve to capture value and some of them don't. But I think we're in an interesting time of experimentation where we'll find that out.
So one thing I'm very critical of is protocols that their entire value capture proposition is will become money. I feel that that's extremely lazy. B, the barrier to creating money should be extremely high. So atoms are not intended to be money. They're not designed to be money. And I like trying to build systems where there is a clear value accrual narrative without just a saying our only way forward is hope we become money, and you get to take the billionth of a % chance that this becomes global money.
So relative to that, what's the clear narrative for atoms capturing long-term value?
The clear narrative for atoms capturing long-term value is, well, that atoms are a social coordination mechanism. That atoms are sort of a new generation social structure. We've experimented things with DAOs and stuff like that, but coupling it to the consensus innovations that Tendermint has created, we're really creating a new facility for people to coordinate with each other. And then the second thing is I think people are starting to take this narrative of crypto capital. I'm sure that's a valid description of of ideas that we came up with 3 years ago. But basically, we wanted to create sort of this ultimate form of discounted cash flow valued collateral that atoms are there to be slashed and to be your collateral to secure high value networks.
Yeah, I think I'm always hesitant to put labels on things, but in general, I think there's this narrative of a work token essentially. And it means different things to different people, but essentially it's about providing collateral in the form of a token, which gives you the opportunity to perform work on a network, which may be validating and securing a blockchain, or it may be providing some resource in response to some demand. And the value capture narrative around that is, as the usage of the network increases, then the fees that are flowing into this network get accrued by the workers who are performing this work. And I think there's a pretty clear connection and story there that applies at kind of many layers and many different protocols. So back to Nick's original question, I think that's one particular area where there's kind of a clear story for value creation. If you're just looking at ETH versus Ethereum, I don't know if that, or ETH versus Bitcoin, I don't know if that applies, but.
But there are some people that may push back on that, though, right, and say, particularly for something like atoms, right, like if the work you're doing is earning atoms, it's kind of a circular argument that
it's extremely circular and not intended to be the long-term value proposition.
Yep.
The long-term value proposition is to like generate value based on assets under management by like this collective network, and to generate value based on usage and fees.
Yep.
Yeah. So I will say that's kind of true. That's mostly true. But before we talk about that, we need to look at, for a project, before we can talk about capturing value, we need to know what the value proposition for the project is, right? And then you capture part of that value. So for Bitcoin, for example, you can use the store of value, you can use this transaction medium. But I would say Bitcoin is very difficult for Bitcoin to capture the transaction values or media of exchange, because they're just much better media of exchange than Bitcoin itself, right? So Bitcoin mostly capture the value of store of value, demand. And for us, we are, cryptoeconomically, we're kind of designed just like a Bitcoin. So we support, multiple assets, Turing complete sort of smart contract platform. But on the other hand, we are, proof of work and we can say even slow and expensive, not to optimize for transactions, but only optimize for store of value or store of assets. And we can definitely talk a little bit more details. But I think before we design any cryptoeconomics, we have to think about what the goal is. It can't be just, the network can do this, can do transactions, therefore the value is facilitating transactions.
So you guys have written some interesting stuff, particularly around this idea that most kind of smart contract platforms to date have been kind of designed from a cryptoeconomics perspective to be kind of transaction processing platforms rather than kind of value preservation platforms, right? So I think that's a really interesting insight that not a lot of people are talking about. So maybe unpack that a little bit, maybe in the context of Ethereum, because that's kind of the most the most well-known smart contract platform.
Yeah, so one narrative of Ethereum is the decentralized computer. And if that's basically you use ETH to pay for the gas cost, right? So decentralized computation. So the idea is, right, the intrinsic value of gas is such that, you need to buy it so that to pay for your transactions. But the way we look at it is that transactions will naturally move to where it is cheapest, because, the people that care about transactions, they care about cost. And this is why centralized exchanges have the majority of the volume among token exchange, because it's cheapest, more efficient. So it's difficult that the way we look at it for any one platform to dominate the transaction case, especially with layer 2 coming up and can provide, unlimited transaction capabilities. So, but nobody so far is looking at, on the multi-asset platform, how to be a store of value. And it's important because if you look at how the resources are consumed, if you think about transactions, they consume sort of moment in time bandwidth and computation. But these are regenerable, renewable resources, right? The next second, they will be available to you again. But if you think about something that more of a long-term, and like a Bitcoin, you buy it, you put it there in some assets, they occupy global state, right? So they occupy instead of transact. So your economics have to be designed around that resource. And this is basically our approach from, in a nutshell.
So as I understand it, is basically right now, as kind of the Ethereum state grows, for example, there's no, miners aren't properly incentivized, right?
Yeah.
And so your idea is to reward miners as state grows.
Yeah, so long term, so we want to make sure even there's no transaction ever happen on Nervos common knowledge base, miners will be compensated. And then knowing that it's important, because otherwise, how would you trust the network to, keep custody of your asset for long term? And the way we do that is, some sort of state rent, but again, not the same as Ethereum state rent, but more from inflation point of view. So our token is basically a byte of the global state. And then, so as long as you occupy those, then there's opportunity cost you have to pay for the miners.
So Zaki, in Cosmos, you guys have talked and written some about kind of a multi-token model, right? What's the state of that? I mean, for those that are following Cosmos, you've likely read about Photon, so I'm curious kind of how you guys are thinking about that recently.
So I guess our recent thinking about photons has been, so, the initial idea of, so Cosmos is designed for atoms not to be a transactional token. Right now we have relatively few transactions on the network. Mostly people are either staking, withdrawing rewards, or participating in governance and moving tokens between exchanges. This is very early days of Cosmos. And then the question has been, how do you bring other tokens onto Cosmos? Cosmos is designed for fees to be paid in multiple tokens. It's already designed to be a multi-token system, but we only have a single token on the hub today. Couple of ways that could happen is, one is the hub could decide to start issuing a process for issuing tokens. The hub could, or we get IBC on the hub, and that introduces an entire world of new tokens issued by many zones onto the hub. The Photon has always been a bit of an art project, is the way I would describe it. Because, as I've said, the idea of issuing money or creating something that is a fee token for the entire network is a pretty high bar, but it's potentially an interesting experiment. And a big part of our whole narrative around Photons has always been about bringing communities together. So we've always looked at ways of onboarding, the Bitcoin community, the Ethereum community, onto Cosmos, perhaps through this Photon mechanism. So we've continued to think a lot about the capability to do some sort of large scale airdrop that takes advantage of the performance capabilities of the Cosmos blockchain to do something that's extremely large scale and distributes a significant amount of this new token to sort of existing networks participants. But other than that, that's kind of where we're at. But I like the idea of doing a big art project, but it does trade off with the large number of practical day-to-day things that the network needs built.
So that gets us to one of our next topics, which is kind of token distribution, right? And I think, airdrops were somewhat popular maybe a year ago. And you had, ERC20 tokens being airdropped to ETH holders or anyone who has an MKR token or things like that. But I know for me, and I think a lot of people, is if you are just getting airdropped something, then it's and it doesn't have much value. It doesn't give you much interest or attachment to a project. And so most Ethereum holders have probably hundreds of tokens that they'll never touch, right? That are airdropped. Doug, I know you kind of were one of the first to, or maybe the first to. Work on this idea of Merkle mining, right? So maybe talk a lot about, for those that don't know, what is kind of this Merkle mining idea for Livepeer, and why did you take this approach?
Sure thing. So related to something Zaki just mentioned, you want your network in a kind of a stake-based network. You want a wide community of people to be able to have access to participate in this network. In a stake-based network, you actually need the token in the first place before you can participate and earn the token through incentives. It's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. So what we said at Livepeer is when we launch our network, we want a mechanism that gives access to everyone, or our proxy for everyone was everyone who was an Ethereum holder. But we wanted to do it in a way that we didn't control. We weren't conducting an airdrop where we were just sending token to everyone. We wanted them to have the ability to come in and mine the token, or essentially generate stake, and have it all be encoded algorithmically in the protocol from Genesis, such that we weren't in control of who gets this token or who's building stake in the network. And so we created this mechanism called a Merkle mine, where every Ethereum holder had an opportunity to come in and generate a proof and submit a proof that they were an Ethereum holder, and they would get a little bit of Livepeer token. But the catch was, most people aren't going to do that. They're not going to be aware that this exists, or they're not going to care. But we still want them in the future to be able to participate in the Livepeer network. So what we did is we allowed other people to come in and generate proofs on their behalf. So for example, Wendy could say, Zaki never submitted his proof. I'll come and submit it on Zaki's behalf. Zaki will get a little bit of Livepeer token sent to him through the transaction, but Wendy will get to take a small cut of Zaki's tokens. And so there was 2.6 million eligible Ethereum addresses. That means 2.6 million proofs could be submitted to the blockchain. And over a 6-month period, what we saw is thousands of people participating, submitting proofs, building up stake of Livepeer token, but facilitating access to the Livepeer network for everyone. And remember, this is just for the genesis state of the network. What those people would then do is participate in the network and stake and begin to earn and build up their position of Livepeer token over time through doing work on the network. And that's a quick overview. There's some drawbacks and some challenges around this, but overall it worked really effectively in that you had thousands of people who were really well qualified to participate in the network by doing the actions you needed to do to participate in this Merkle mine, to then run infrastructure on Livepeer that encodes video, or participate in the delegation and governance process of the network through kind of web-based miner. We had open access, we have a great community, and I still haven't met someone who told me that they Merkle mined and has not participated in the network. So it was really effective at building a community.
So Wendy, from an investor perspective, what are your thoughts on something like a Merkle mine, and are there other types of kind of token distribution mechanisms that you've found particularly exciting recently?
So I like to use this analogy of protocols as being digital economies that are contained within this protocol, and the people that get to participate are token holders. And I think in very much like a company, you want the participants, you want to pay the participants enterprise value that are your employees. Essentially, you want the people that are doing work for this organization, this economy. And in a protocol, you want to pay your network value in the form of tokens to the workers, or the people that could ultimately become the workers. And so in many cases, it's hard to tell with more sort of generalized protocols who these workers will be, and maybe the acts that they'll be performing are totally new types of work that haven't really even been discovered yet. E.g. sort of Bitcoin mining. And then you kind of have to distribute it in a way that you can get them to start doing the work for you once they obviously have this incentive mechanism ahead of them. But then there are other more particular cases where, for example, Livepeer, the people that can do the work are specialized probably in video and know kind of this industry a little bit. And so there's probably ways where you can better target those people to get them to become sort of the employees, so to speak, and shareholders of this digital economy.
So Zaki, given that photons are something that Cosmos is kind of still exploring, and clearly you're thinking about how to distribute these in a fair way to people that care about the project. I'm curious just your general thoughts on something like Merkle mining versus other types of approaches.
We've also done, so Game of Stakes was a big experiment in this too. And it was an analysis of a problem, which was a big part of our validator community didn't participate in the fundraiser. So we wanted them to be part of, and I think that experiment turned out extremely well. If you look at the top 10 validators, 4 of our validators, the only reason they were able to participate in Genesis was the tokens that they got in the Game of Stakes. So that was like this sort of kind of a proof of work mechanism, and it was enormously successful. The other sort of big experiment here that I'm curious to see how it's going to turn out is like the handshake GitHub airdrop. It's like a big token and distribution experiment that I'm like very excited about, like what's going to happen with that, and is there going to be meaningful engagement, yes or no? And so I think all of these things, we are building these like open state databases. So that seems to be like a really cool property of them. I think without a doubt the token distribution of Bitcoin is probably the closest thing that you can get to describing what Bitcoin actually is. Because it's not software, it's not, it's a meme and it's a token distribution, it's really nothing else. And so like all of those things seem like valuable insights and like enormous places to explore. I think Game of Stakes was like what it looks like when one of those, like this set of ideas like fully comes together and you actually are able to like produce a better network through an experimentation in token distribution. And so, you know, when I think about these ideas and I decide to put like what I'm going to put my time and energy for, I'm kind of like wanting all of these pieces to come together. Like, how is this going to make the network a better place? Is it going to solve a specific problem that we have? Is it going to produce something amazing? And so continue to think about that. But it's like really, we should be experimenting as much as possible in this area. The other thing I think is cool is what like Eric Meltzer is doing with Satoshi Treasure about like distributed keys through like an id-world game.
And Kevin, how about you and how you guys are thinking about kind of broad distribution of Nervos tokens?
Yeah, so we actually are thinking about this a lot because we're launching test this weekend. So we're actually getting the phase where, you know, it's really coming up for us. And again, we're a proof of work project. So, you know, a lot of our thoughts are going to like, how do you bootstrap, you know, proof of work network, and, you know, who do you want to be able to mine your tokens? So, we still have details to work out, but I can share like the thought process that went through. So first of all, you know, the number one question people ask is, are you going to be ASIC friendly, or are you going to be, you know, ASIC resistance, right? So we're going to be, you know, we say we're ASIC neutral, which means that it's possible to build ASIC. We're not going to be, you know, claiming it's impossible to do it. So it's possible, but we're going to launch into an ASIC vacuum. In other words, we're going to use a new hash algorithm. I think this is very, very important for new POW projects. So that's number one. And also, you know, if you think about when we, you know, get started, we want to make sure not just the current professional miner community will be able to mine the token or have a huge advantage. So we want to give our you know, users or you know, non-professional users who have a day job and just don't have a lot of time to buy GPUs or farms to also be able to mine tokens, right? So so we're thinking about doing something, you know, around towards the end of the testnet and when the mainnet starts. So like there's going to be some period of time when it's possible still to mine just with CPUs. Now that have, you know, risks, but then we're going to control that so that that can be mitigated by the duration of time, and also, you know, if it's before mainnet, then, you know, we can also protect it. And then when you talk about GPU mining, when we talk to a lot of miners, there's actually a difference between low, sort of low requirement graphic cards versus high premium, high-end graphic cards. So if we were to choose a high-end graphic card GPU algorithm, that would mean that it's going to be very centralized because, you know, the manufacturers that can produce the components on these high-end graphic cards are very, very centralized. Right, so there are only just a few that can pump out these cards and have a huge advantage. So we're probably going to look at, you know, towards the low end, and people can participate. So it's all surrounded about, you know, in the short term, how can we engage the community so people will come in and mine and earn tokens, and also being secure as well.
So we've got about 6 minutes left. I guess one other question for you guys, and then we may open it up to the audience if we have time, is, you know, from a token perspective, as I said at the beginning, I think there's been a lack of experimentation in crypto economics. Part of that might just because there's, you know, the ICO wave is dead. And for the most part, and maybe some people would disagree, but you know, so my question is do you guys think there's going to be a next wave? And if so, you know, what does that next wave look like? Is it a platform like Cosmos comes out with a token standard that makes it really easy for you know, teams to launch their own zones with tokens, and that catalyzes it? Or is it something like, you know, Binance IEOs, or how do you guys think about kind of the future of experimentation in tokens? And maybe start with Wendy.
Right. So I think there has been a lot of sort of behind the scenes experimentation, just given kind of where regulatory guidance has been. People are a little bit more careful about sort of being outspoken about them, and also more careful about launching because, once these things are launched and live, it's hard to take them back, and it's harder to iterate on protocols and standards. And so, but the interesting thing about cryptoeconomics is that I think it's not sort of a defensible asset on its own, right? Because once you launch it, it's a public good. So it makes sense that you're seeing kind of less innovation on this side because it is a public good, and therefore it's probably underserved. But ultimately what makes these tokens defensible is once you launch and then people have them in their hands and you start to sort of create communities that generate buzz and start using these tokens. And so I do expect to see more innovation coming in kind of the next few months even, and definitely years.
Cool. So one area that I think we're going to see like whole new realm of experimentation and new models is that we're about to enter this like networked blockchain world through projects like Cosmos with IBC and interblockchain communication and Polkadot and ETH 2.0. And there's all sorts of questions that don't have great answers yet, which are, how are these app-specific chains or zones that live independently going to incentivize relayers to relay these transactions across chain? How are they going to secure their own chains when they're just bootstrapping and don't have enough value at stake to create security? How are they going to do their interblockchain communication, and do you need to coordinate that via a token mechanism? And so there's lots of ideas, but as you drill into the details, you realize this is like still a blank design space, and we're going to see lots and lots of experiments play out, and I think new roles for new actors in crypto networks as a result.
So one of the things I think is particularly unique about the Cosmos SDK and sort of separates it from a lot of like the blockchain building toolkits that you've seen from like earlier projects and projects that are like in Hyperledger, is that it was oriented to design credible cryptoeconomic systems, not just like generic blockchain transaction engines. And we've like put a lot of energy into making sure that like you could run the economics, simulate the economics. All of that stuff sort of comes out of the box in the Cosmos SDK. So I'd be like really excited to see more projects doing more experimental mechanism design on top of this platform, because there was a number of things you could do on like Solidity, but like the design space on top of a platform like the Cosmos SDK is much bigger, and like we've given powerful tools away.
Yeah, I think in general, cryptoeconomic design, if you want to do it well, the blockchain itself has to have a point of view, a very strong or unique value proposition. Otherwise, there's just no good cryptoeconomic design because you don't know what to optimize for. So I think the answer to your question is, I believe there are going to be more blockchains that are have a unique value proposition instead of being just a generic processing platform. And then when we see people sort of pivoting from that value proposition, then the most powerful weapon for entrepreneurs is going to be, okay, how can I design my cryptoeconomics so it's most suited for what my project wants to do, the value proposition. So yeah, I think absolutely. I think Ethereum being the first one that come out, they probably didn't have to think very thoroughly what they want to do. They want to be a generic computation platform, but all the other ones that are new ones starting up, I think probably need to think about more like what are unique things we bring to the table.
And are you building a token standard on top of the Nervos CKB?
Yeah, we are. So that's coming up. It's probably going to be after mainnet, and we're going to be working on that.
Got it.
Can I just add one more thing to that spiel? So I think what we've seen a lot is actually more projects going out and trying to get users first, and then designing the business models on top later. And I think tokens are essentially business models, right? And so as we realize protocols can do more and more things now that we have the base layer infrastructures kind of more or less figured out, people are experimenting with new business models, and they're acquiring customers first and then building those business models next. And I think that's natural.
Okay. We've got time for one question, if anyone has any.
The one, I agree that the layer one is settled in some cases, but the one area where I think it's not is the security token space. About 90% of security tokens live on Ethereum. And in our experience, that's probably not where they're going to live in the future. Have you guys thought anything about kind of what cryptoeconomics might look like for asset-backed tokens. That's something that we're experimenting at. Curious if you guys have thought of that.
Kevin or Zaki, that would be probably you guys.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about from a layer one perspective, like how we think about this problem. And then when you have asset-backed tokens or security tokens, then we're talking about transferring, sort of mapping real-world value onto the blockchain, right? And those can be, very, very valuable. So one theory that we have is the layer one protocol itself has to be secure enough to be able to support, the transactions of these very highly valuable assets. For example, if the asset itself is $100 million, but your platform is only $10 million, right? So it's very easy to attack the blockchain, the base platform itself to double spend the asset in a way, right? So that's something that we think a lot about, and then we want to make sure that the base layer token need to be able to capture the value of the assets running on the platform itself. And for us, it's through resource occupation, state storage occupation, so that there's a direct value capture path to that. We think that's very important for such as STO tokens coming, like very valuable real world assets coming to blockchain.